It seems to me that there are two key questions around Easter Sunday. One pertains to Jesus' body, and this is often framed up as, do you believe that Jesus physically rose from the dead? The other pertains to the purpose of whatever the resurrection was. And this is often framed up as, do you believe that he died for our sins? I'd like to spend a few moments this morning going through the various appearance stories to look at what they say about these questions of body and purpose. I start with the earliest, St. Paul. In Acts 9, Paul, probably a number of years after Jesus' death, was confronted by a bright light and a voice. He saw no body, touched no scars. Yet he had seemed to have no doubt that this was the risen Jesus, and he radically changed his life. Paul equates this experience of his with the experience of the disciples, some 500 by his reckoning, to whom the resurrected Jesus appeared. And he does so in order to validate his claim to be an apostle. The interesting thing is that seeing a literal body or an apparition does not seem to be essential to experiencing the risen Christ. Mark's Gospel has two endings. One is original, ending at 16 and verse 8, and the other is a later addition. The original has no appearances of the risen Jesus. The women are met by an angelic being, whatever that was, and flee in terror. The later edition states that he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, then to two of them as they were walking in the country, and lastly to the 11. Only to the 11 does the resurrected one speak, commissioning them to preach. He then ascends to heaven, wherever that is. Mark's later edition has no reference to place, save the country walkers, and there's no touching and little speaking. Matthew's Gospel has just two appearance stories. The two Marys are fleeing the empty tomb when they meet the resurrected Jesus. He greets them, they touch his feet, and worship him, whatever worship means in that context. He gives them a message to ask his brothers to go to Galilee. And the second scene is, surprisingly, or not surprisingly, in Galilee, on a mountain with the 11. They see, worship, and interestingly, some doubt. He commissions them, doubters and all, to go and make disciples. There's no ascension into heaven or to anywhere else. In these texts so far, there's been little concern about body. By and large, the faithful have made the connection between this risen apparition and the Jesus they knew. Yet there's no inference that the same old pre-crucifixion Jesus is going to continue walking around and talking and growing old with them. Few words are spoken. The appearances seem to be for the purpose of underscoring the belief that death has not defeated God's purpose, and the task of the disciples is only just beginning. There's no mention of dying for sins or indeed dying for any purpose. Luke's Gospel, likewise, has only two appearance stories. The first is the journey to Emmaus. Without going into the rich nuances of this story, make two comments. Firstly, about body. They didn't recognize the risen Jesus, even though they walked and talked with him for a long time and he spoke about himself. It was when he broke bread that they recognized him, and then poof, he vanished. The lack of recognition and the vanishing tells us that this resurrected body was quite different from a normal flesh and blood body. Secondly, the purpose of the Emmaus encounter seems to be about restoring and encouraging the faith of the two travellers. It's also set within the context of the early Christian community, who met to examine the scriptures, offer hospitality, share bread, and encourage each other, as we heard in the first reading today. Emmaus is a great example of the power of story to both reflect and to shape practice. The other appearance story in Luke is also located in Jerusalem. The resurrected one appears paranormally in the midst of a group of disciples, including the 11. He tries to calm them. There they are, for the first time, words spoken about his body being normal flesh and blood, and then eating some fish to prove this. The risen one spends some time in a Bible study, encouraging them, and he walks with them to Bethany and then ascends into heaven, again paranormally. Like with the second story like with the Emmaus encounter, this second story tells us that the bodily apparition was unlike any normal body, even though they have this thing about eating and with fish. The main concern of the text seems to be about establishing continuity between what they were experiencing and their knowledge of Jesus before. Interestingly, the ascension bit is repeated by Luke in his next book called Acts. And it's in Acts that we get this idea that Jesus hung around for 40 days, 40 being a code for testing. It's also in Acts that we get the idea that they had to wait until Pentecost in order to experience the Holy Spirit. Whereas in John's Gospel, the resurrected one breathes on them and they receive the Spirit immediately. The risen one in Acts then ascends into the clouds as Elijah once did. And lastly, in the fourth Gospel, or John's Gospel, there are 4 appearance stories. The first is Mary Magdalene in the garden. And she takes the risen Jesus for the gardener. One wonders what he was dressed in. And the risen one explicitly tells Mary not to touch him. It's his voice that is the means of the recognition, like with St. Paul on the Damascus Road. Secondly, as we heard in the reading from the Gospel today, then his appearance to his disciples behind locked doors in Jerusalem. The doors and passing through shut doors again tells us this body is not normal. The third encounter is to the same group a week later, plus Thomas. We're not told what the resurrected one did in the intervening week. Maybe he went to the beach. Note too, there are now 12 disciples, whereas Matthew and Luke both had 11. In fact, if you read the Bible carefully, it's not clear who the 12 were or the 11 were. This encounter is very bodily focused. Thomas is asked to put his finger in the scars, although we're not told that he did so. The resurrected Jesus then says that blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe, which is a bit different from what Paul said in 1 Corinthians, because he said, well, to be a valid apostle, you have to have had an encounter with the risen Christ. And the last of John's encounters with the risen one is at the beach in Galilee. There are 7 disciples and they're out fishing, no success, throw the net on the other side, and 153 big ones. It's interesting that somebody counted all those fish. Then the resurrected Jesus had a Eucharistic meal with them, bread and fish again. Later, Jesus asks Peter 3 questions and predicts Peter's death. These 4 Johannine stories continue themes from Luke. They are stories about restoration and empowerment, bringing those fractured followers back together, and in the midst, sharing bread and fish and Holy Spirit. Secondly, there are stories that continue to give this mixed message about the body, whether it was real or unreal, whether it was continuous, discontinuous. And lastly, there are stories that identify key authority figures in the early church. Mary Magdalene, the 12 or 11, Peter, and the anonymous beloved disciple. Note Bishop Jack Spong's thesis that the purpose of the appearance stories is to establish the authority and primacy of Peter and the 12 in the early church. Interestingly, it's only in Paul in 1 Corinthians that the key leader of the Jerusalem church is named. That is, of course, James. These appearance stories have been told and retold and reshaped over the decades between Jesus' death and the writing of the Gospels, and are primarily like theological novels rather than historical textbooks. There are a number of common elements in the stories, yet each writer and editor is quite distinct. There's little evidence that the stories were harmonized, or that anyone thought the lack of harmony was an issue. It was as if they're trying to say, look, we're not in agreement with each other, but these stories are passed around our communities. Now you figure out the meanings and the contradictions. So I don't find it surprising today that Christians understand the resurrected Jesus differently from each other. Some, of course, believe that there was a miraculous revivification of his body on Easter Day. Others believe in what you could call a spiritual resurrection. The appearance stories, for example, can be understood as post-death experiences, such as described in other writings of the ancient world and in modern literature about death and trauma experience. The early Christians did struggle with what the crucifixion and resurrection meant, and drew upon their Hebrew scriptures to find meaning. Ideas of redemptive suffering, a cosmic atonement, divine vindication, and the like were the result. Yet in the appearance stories in the Gospels and St. Paul, they largely bypass these sort of big theological issues. Rather, what seems to be presented is a kaleidoscope of unsynchronized spiritual experiences in which Jesus' friends found restoration, empowerment, and hope after the devastation of Good Friday. In Galilee or Jerusalem, fishing or in locked rooms, eating or studying, walking or talking, women and men discovered the power of Jesus' presence was still with them, permeating through the veil of death.